Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. There is a stretch of desert on the western edge of Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the earth is the color of old bone. It is a flat, featureless place, miles of sandy dirt and scrub brush and low, wind-bent grasses that seem to grow only because nothing else will. During the day, the sun beats down on this land with a kind of cruelty that feels personal, and during the night, the darkness that settles over it is so deep and so complete that you could stand in the middle of it and feel as though you've been swallowed by something ancient. The locals call this area the West Mesa. It is a place that has always existed on the margins of the city, a buffer between the emptiness of the New Mexico desert. It is the kind of place where people build houses because the land is cheap, and it is the kind of place where people dump things they do not want found. For years, the West Mesa was nothing more than a footnote in Albuquerque's geography, a patch of undeveloped land that most residents drove past without a second thought. But in February of 2009, that changed. The desert gave up its dead, and the city would never look at that land the same way again. It was a Saturday afternoon, February 2009. The air was dry and cold, the winter sun sitting low in a pale sky. A woman named Christine Ross was walking her dog across the open desert just south of 118th Street, near the intersection of Dennis Chavez Boulevard. This was not unusual. People walked their dogs out here all the time. The development that had been planned for this stretch of land had stalled. The housing market had collapsed. The construction crews had packed up, and the half-graded lots and surveyors' stakes stood like monuments to a dream that had run out of money. So the desert had been reclaimed by the walkers, the joggers, the people who liked the silence and the open space. Christine's dog, a curious animal with a strong nose, had wandered a little ahead of her, sniffing along the edge of a dirt mound that had been pushed up by a bulldozer months earlier. The construction crews had been doing preliminary grading, work before the project was abandoned. They had moved earth around, carved shallow trenches, pushed mounds of dirt and sand from one place to another. The dog stopped at the base of one of these mounds and began to dig. Christine called the dog, but it did not come. She walked over, annoyed, and saw that the dog had uncovered something white and smooth, partially buried in the loose soil. She bent down and brushed some of the dirt away. It was a bone, a large bone, too large to be from a rabbit or a coyote. She stared at it for a moment, then pulled her dog away and called the police. The first officers to arrive treated it as a routine call. Human remains found in the desert were not unheard of in Albuquerque. The city sits at the crossroads of several major drug trafficking routes, and the surrounding desert had a long history of yielding the occasional body, a migrant who had died of exposure, a drug deal gone wrong, a suicide. A forensic team was dispatched, and they began to carefully excavate the area around the bone. Within hours, it was clear that this was not a single body. There were more bones, scattered and mixed in the soil, and then more still. By the end of the first day, investigators had found the remains of at least 2 individuals. By the end of the first week, that number had grown. The excavation expanded, the crime scene tape stretched wider, and more forensic specialists were called in. The earth kept giving, bone after bone after bone, over the following weeks. The West Mesa became the largest crime scene in Albuquerque's history. Teams of forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and investigators worked in a grid pattern, carefully sifting through tons of soil, cataloging every fragment, every tooth, every scrap of clothing and jewelry that emerged from the ground. The media descended, helicopters circled overhead. Reporters stood at the perimeter of the crime scene and delivered breathless updates to cameras while behind them, men and women in white suits knelt in the dirt with brushes and trowels, doing the slow, painstaking work of recovering the dead. By the time the excavation was complete, the remains of 11 women and 1 unborn child had been recovered from the West Mesa. 11 women, buried in a stretch of desert that was supposed to become a housing development. 11 women whose disappearances had, for years, gone largely unnoticed. That is the fact that makes this case so difficult to talk about. and so important to tell. These women had vanished from the streets of Albuquerque over a period of years, and while some of their families had filed missing person reports and begged for help, the broader community had barely registered their absence. Many of them had been involved in sex work. Many of them had struggled with addiction. And in a city that was dealing with its own epidemic of drug violence and poverty, these women had fallen through every crack in the system. They were invisible in life, and they remained invisible in death, until a dog on a Saturday walk uncovered the edge of something terrible. This is the story of the West Mesa bone collector, a case that remains one of the largest unsolved serial murder investigations in the history of the United States. It is a story about the women who were taken, the failures that allowed them to disappear, and the agonizing search for a killer who has never been brought to justice. To understand how 11 women could vanish from a single city without raising a sustained alarm, you have to understand Albuquerque in the early 2000s. The city was changing, and not for the better. The economy was struggling, unemployment was rising, and the drug trade, which had always been a presence in the border states, was metastasizing in ways that local law enforcement was not equipped to handle. Methamphetamine, in particular, had torn through the city's lower-income neighborhoods like a wildfire. Entire communities were hollowed out by addiction, families shattered. Young people who had once held jobs and attended school found themselves living on the streets, selling their bodies, stealing, doing whatever was necessary to feed a habit that consumed everything it touched. The area along East Central Avenue, the old Road 66, became the epicenter of this crisis. It was a stretch of road lined with aging motels, pawn shops, liquor stores, and vacant lots, and at night it became something else entirely. Women stood on the corners and in the doorways, waiting for cars to slow down. They climbed into vehicles with strangers. They disappeared into motel rooms and came back out an hour later, or they didn't come back out at all. The women who worked East Central were among the most vulnerable people in the city. They were exposed to violence every single night. They were assaulted, robbed, raped, and sometimes murdered. And these crimes were rarely investigated with the same urgency that would have been applied if the victims had come from different circumstances. This was the world in which the West Mesa victims lived and eventually vanished. The first of the 11 women to be identified was Monica Candelaria. Monica was born in Albuquerque in 1977. She grew up in a large, close-knit family in the South Valley, a neighborhood that was poor but proud, a place where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other's children. Monica was the kind of girl who lit up a room. She had a wide, bright smile and a laugh that carried, and she was fiercely loyal to the people she loved. As a child, she was energetic and playful, always organizing games in the backyard, always the first to volunteer to help her mother in the kitchen. She loved music, to dance. She dreamed at various points in her childhood of becoming a nurse, a teacher, a singer. The specifics changed, but the underlying impulse was always the same. Monica wanted to be around people, wanted to help, wanted to make things better for the people in her life. Her family adored her. Her younger siblings looked up to her. She was, by every account, a warm and generous person who drew others to her with an effortless, natural kindness. But Monica's life took a turn in her late teens. The details are not entirely clear, and her family has spoken about this with the kind of careful, protective sadness that suggests deep love and deep pain in equal measure. What is known is that Monica began using drugs in her late adolescence. It may have started with marijuana, then moved to cocaine, and eventually to methamphetamine. The progression was cruel and familiar. The girl who had once been the center of every family gathering began to drift. She missed holidays. She stopped calling. She disappeared for days, then weeks, then months at a time. Her family searched for her. They drove the streets looking for her. They called shelters and hospitals, and eventually the police. But Monica was caught in the grip of something that was stronger than their love, stronger than her own desire to be free. She began working on East Central Avenue. She was 25 years old the last time her family saw her alive. In 2003, Monica Candelaria disappeared. Her family reported her missing, but the report generated little urgency. She was a known sex worker with a drug problem. In the grim calculus of law enforcement resources, she was not a priority. Her file sat in a drawer, and the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into years, and Monica was just gone. The second victim to be identified was Cinnamon Elks. Cinnamon was just 23 years old when she disappeared in 2004. She had grown up in Albuquerque as well, and like Monica, she had been a bright, lively child who had been pulled into a world of addiction and exploitation at a painfully young age. Her family remembered her as sweet and sensitive, a girl who loved animals and had a particular fondness for horses. She dreamed of living on a ranch someday, of wide open spaces and clean air and the smell of hay. But those dreams faded as the addiction took hold. Cinnamon ended up on East Central like so many others, and when she stopped answering her phone and stopped showing up at the places where her family expected to find her, the silence that followed was devastating. Her mother, Dorothy Elks, would become one of the most vocal advocates for the West Mesa victims, a woman who refused to let her daughter's name be forgotten, who demanded answers from a system that had failed to protect her child. Then there was Michelle Valdez. Michelle was 22 when she vanished in 2004. She had a young son, a little boy who needed his mother, and the knowledge that she would never come home to him is one of the most heartbreaking dimensions of this case. Michelle had struggled with addiction, but she was trying to get clean. She had told her family that she wanted to change, that she wanted to be there for her son, that she was tired of the life she was living. Those conversations are the ones her family replays in their minds, the promises of a future that was stolen before it could begin. Michelle's mother, Victoria Chavez, spent years searching for her daughter, putting up flyers, calling the police, walking the streets of East Central, asking anyone who would listen if they had seen her daughter. The answer was always the same: no one knew anything, or no one was willing to talk. Victoria Chavez did not yet know that her daughter was lying in a shallow grave just a few miles from where she was searching. None of the families knew. For years, while these mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers were walking the streets and making phone calls and lying awake at wondering if their loved ones were alive or dead, the West Mesa sat silent under the desert sun, keeping its secrets. Jamie Barella was another of the 11. Jamie was 15 years old when she disappeared. 15, she was a child, a ninth grader who should have been worrying about homework and school dances and what she was going to wear on Friday night. Instead, she was on the streets, caught up in a world that no 15-year-old should ever have to navigate. The circumstances of how Jamie ended up in that world are unclear, and her family has guarded her memory with a fierce protectiveness that is entirely understandable. What is known is that Jamie was reported missing in 2004, and that she was the youngest of the West Mesa victims. Her presence among the dead is a reminder that the vulnerability exploited by the killer was not limited to adults. Children, too, were at risk. Children, too, were being consumed by the forces that had turned East Central Avenue into a hunting ground. Doreen Marquez was 32 when she disappeared in 2004. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister. She had struggled with addiction for years, cycling through periods of sobriety and relapse that left her family exhausted and heartbroken, but never willing to give up on her. Doreen had a quiet strength that her family recognized even when she was at her lowest. She never stopped being kind. She never stopped caring about the people around her. Even on the streets, she looked out for other women, warned them about dangerous clients, shared whatever she had. When she vanished, the women who knew her on East Central noted her absence before anyone else did. They talked about it in low voices, in the parking lots of motels and on the corners where they waited for cars. Something had happened to Doreen, something bad. But no one knew what, and no one with the power to investigate seemed to care. Evelyn Salazar was 26. She had been working on East Central for several years, and she had survived more violence than most people can imagine. She had been beaten, she had been robbed, she had been threatened with weapons. She had developed the kind of hypervigilance that comes from living in constant danger, always watching, always listening, always ready to run. But even that vigilance was not enough to save her. Evelyn disappeared in 2003, and her absence was noted by her family and by the other women on the street. but the investigation into her disappearance went nowhere. There were no leads, no witnesses, no evidence. She was simply gone. Veronica Romero was 28, Julie Nieto was 23, Sylvia Hutton was 19, Virginia Cloven was 23, Jessica Robel was 28. One by one, these women had disappeared from the streets of Albuquerque between 2001 and 2005. Some of them worked the same stretches of East Central Avenue, stood on the same corners, climbed into the same kinds of cars. They shared the same dangers, the same addictions, the same desperate hope would be the night they made enough money to get by, and the same quiet terror that tonight might be the night they did not come home. And one by one, they had been taken to the West Mesa, killed, and buried in the desert sand. The question that haunted Albuquerque in the weeks and months after the discovery was a simple one, and it had no simple answer: how? How had 11 women disappeared over a period of 4 years without anyone connecting the dots? How had a serial killer operated in a mid-sized American city for half a decade without being detected? The answer, as painful as it is to confront, lies in the intersection of poverty, addiction, stigma, and systemic failure. These women were not invisible because they were unimportant. They were invisible because the systems that should have protected them, law enforcement, social services, the community at large, had decided, whether consciously or unconsciously, that their lives were worth less than other lives. When a college student disappears, the news runs the story for weeks. Search parties are organized, rewards are offered, detectives work overtime. But when a sex worker with a drug problem disappears, the response is different. The report is filed, the file goes into a stack, the detective moves on to the next case, and the woman is forgotten. This is not an exaggeration. In the years before the West Mesa discovery, the Albuquerque Police Department had received missing person reports for several of the victims. Those reports had been processed, assigned case numbers, and then, in most instances, allowed to languish. There was no task force assigned to investigate the disappearances. There was no analyst looking for patterns. There was no one sitting in a room connecting the dots between one missing woman from East Central, and another from East Central, and another and another. Each case was treated as an isolated incident, a woman who had probably moved to another city, or overdosed in an alley somewhere, or simply chosen to drop out of sight. The possibility that these women were being systematically targeted and killed was apparently not considered until the bodies were found. And even then, even after the discovery of 11 bodies in a mass burial site, the investigation would prove to be one of the most frustrating and heartbreaking in the history of New Mexico law enforcement. Because the West Mesa did not give up its secrets easily. The bodies had been buried in the desert for years, exposed to heat and moisture in the slow, relentless work of decomposition. Many of the remains were skeletal. Clothing had deteriorated. Personal effects were scarce. And whatever forensic evidence might have once linked the killer to his victims had been degraded by time, and the elements to the point where traditional investigative methods were of limited use. The task force that was assembled to investigate the West Mesa murders was large, well-funded, and staffed by experienced detectives. But from the very beginning, they were working at a disadvantage. The crime scene was enormous. The burial site covered an area roughly the size of a football field. The remains were commingled in places, making it difficult to determine which bones belonged to which victim. And the timeline of the murders was uncertain. Without a clear understanding of when each woman had been killed, it was nearly impossible to construct a coherent timeline of the killer's activities, to identify witnesses who might have seen something, or to match the murders to specific events or circumstances that might have pointed toward a suspect. The forensic anthropologists worked for months, painstakingly sorting and cataloging the remains, attempting to match bones to individuals, to determine cause of death where possible, and to extract any DNA evidence that might still be viable. The work was slow and grim. Each bone fragment had to be cleaned, measured, photographed, and entered into a database. Each piece of clothing, each button, each strand of hair had to be treated as a potential piece of evidence. The forensic team worked with a thoroughness that was admirable, but the passage of time had taken its toll. In many cases, the cause of death could not be definitively determined. The bones told a story, but it was a story full of gaps and silences. While the forensic work continued, detectives began the equally painstaking process of identifying the victims. This was not straightforward. The remains were skeletal, which meant that visual identification was impossible. Dental records were the primary tool, but many of the victims had not been to a dentist in years, or their dental records could not be located. DNA comparison was used in several cases, matching the remains to family members who provided samples. One by one the names emerged: Monica Candelaria, Cinnamon Valdez, Jamie Barella, Doreen Marquez, Evelyn Salazar, Veronica Romero, Julie Nieto, Sylvia Hutton, for Jessica Roybal. 11 names, 11 women. 11 lives that had been violently ended and hidden in the dirt. The identification process brought a terrible kind of closure to the families. For years, they had lived in a limbo that was perhaps worse than grief: the not knowing, the endless hoping against hope. The daily oscillation between believing their loved one was alive somewhere and fearing the worst. When the phone calls came, when the detectives arrived at their doors and told them that their daughter, their sister, their mother had been found in the West Mesa, the families described a feeling that was both devastating and, in some strange way, a relief. At least now they knew. At least now they could grieve. At least now they could lay their loved ones to rest. But knowing that their family members were dead did not answer the question that burned hottest in their hearts. Who had done this? Who had taken these women from the streets of Albuquerque, killed them, and buried them in the desert? And that question, which should have been the beginning of the investigation's most intense phase, would instead become the beginning of its most agonizing and its most contentious. Because as the detectives dug into the case, as they began to pull threads and follow leads and build a picture of the world in which these women had lived and died, they found themselves drawn toward a name that had been on the periphery of this world for years, a name that several of the surviving women from East Central Avenue knew and feared. And that name belonged to a man named Lorenzo Montoya. Lorenzo Montoya lived in a small, run-down house near the corner of East Central Avenue and San Mateo Boulevard. This is a detail that is worth pausing on because the geography matters. East Central and San Mateo is one of the most notorious intersections in Albuquerque. It is the heart of the area where the West Mesa victims had worked. It is a place where at any hour of the night, women could be seen standing on the sidewalks and in the doorways of the cheap motels, waiting for clients. Lorenzo Montoya lived right there in the middle of it all. He was a man in his 40s, quiet, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person you would pass on the street without a second glance. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, there was something else. Montoya had a history of violence against women. He had been arrested multiple times for assaulting sex workers. He had been known to pick up women on East Central, bring them to his home, and then become violent, choking them, beating them, threatening them with death. Several women had escaped from his house and reported these attacks to the police. Some of those reports resulted in charges. Some did not, but the pattern was clear. Lorenzo Montoya was a dangerous predator who targeted the most vulnerable women in Albuquerque. And then, in 2006, something happened that would cast Lorenzo Montoya's shadow over the entire West Mesa investigation. In December of that year, a woman was found strangled to death in Montoya's home. Her name was unrelated to the West Mesa case, but the manner of her death, ligature strangulation, was consistent with what investigators would later suspect to be the method used on the West Mesa victims. When police arrived at Montoya's house to arrest him for this murder, they found him in his backyard. There was an altercation, and Lorenzo Montoya was shot and killed by the woman's boyfriend, who had come looking for her. The boyfriend was later cleared of all charges on the grounds of defense of others. Montoya was dead, and with him went any possibility of an interrogation, a confession, or a trial. The timing of Montoya's death is one of the most maddening elements of this case. He died in 2006, 3 years before the West Mesa bodies were discovered. When the investigation into the mass burial site began in 2009, detectives quickly identified Montoya as a person of interest. His proximity to East Central, his history of violence against sex workers, the manner of the 2006 killing, everything pointed in his direction. But Montoya was gone. He could not be questioned in a lineup. He could not be confronted with evidence. And the evidence that might have definitively linked him to the West Mesa murders, DNA fibers, fingerprints, had either been degraded by time or was simply not available. The forensic challenges that had plagued the investigation from the beginning were compounded by the fact that the primary suspect was dead, and his house had been cleaned out and occupied by other people in the years since his death. The detectives worked the Montoya angle as hard as they could. They interviewed people who had known him, women who had survived encounters with him, neighbors who had lived near his house. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Montoya had been a fixture on East Central for years. He was known to cruise the strip in his car, picking up women, bringing them home. Some of these encounters were transactional and uneventful, but others turned violent, and the violence escalated over time. Women who had escaped from Montoya described a man who seemed to derive pleasure from their fear, who would choke them until they lost consciousness and then revive them, who would threaten to kill them if they told anyone what had happened. Several women reported that Montoya had a dog, a large and aggressive animal that he used to intimidate his victims. The dog, they said, would stand in the doorway of the room where the violence was occurring, blocking the exit, growling if the woman tried to move. These accounts were chilling, and they painted a picture of a man who was capable of the West Mesa murders. But capability is not proof, and as the investigation deepened, doubts began to emerge about whether Montoya could have committed all 11 murders by himself. The logistics alone raised questions. How had one man transported 11 bodies to the West Mesa and buried them without being seen? The burial site was not easily accessible. It required driving down unpaved roads and across open desert, a process that would have taken time and effort, and would have been visible to anyone who happened to be in the area. Had Montoya made 11 separate trips to the desert? Had he transported multiple bodies at once? Had he had help? These were not idle questions. They were central to the investigation, and the answers, or the lack of answers, would shape the trajectory of the case for years to come. The West Mesa burial site was located roughly 5 miles from East Central Avenue. 5 miles does not sound like a great distance, but in practical terms, the journey from the strip to the desert involved navigating surface streets, turning onto increasingly isolated roads, and eventually driving across open, undeveloped land where there were no streetlights, no houses, no witnesses. To do this once, with a body in the vehicle, would have required nerve and planning. To do it 11 times, over a period of several years, would have required something more, a familiarity with the terrain, a confidence that the area was not being watched, and a routine that had been refined through repetition. Investigators tried to reconstruct what that routine might have looked like. They studied maps. They drove the route themselves at night, timing the journey, noting the points where a vehicle might be observed and the long stretches where it would not. They concluded that the trip could be made in approximately 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the exact route taken, and that the burial itself, assuming the grave had been dug in advance, could be completed in less than an hour. It was possible in theory for one man to have done this alone, but it would have required discipline, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the area that went beyond casual familiarity. Lorenzo Montoya had lived his entire life in Albuquerque. He knew the city's streets, its rhythms, its blind spots. He knew which road busy and which were deserted. He knew the West Mesa. Or at least he could have known it, as well as anyone. But knowing the area was not the same as being the killer, and the detectives working the case were acutely aware of the danger of building a case around a dead man simply because he was convenient. The history of criminal investigation is littered with cases where law enforcement settled on a suspect too early, ignored evidence that pointed in other directions, and declared a case solved when it was anything but. The West Mesa Task Force did not want to be another example of that failure. They wanted proof, and proof was proving extraordinarily difficult to find. One of the most significant obstacles was the condition of the remains themselves. The forensic anthropologists had been able to determine that the victims were female, to estimate their ages, and in some cases to identify signs of trauma on the bones. But the specific cause of death for most of the victims remained undetermined. Soft tissue had long since decomposed, which meant that evidence of strangulation, the method that Montoya had used in the 2006 killing, would not necessarily be visible on the skeletal remains. Strangulation, particularly ligature strangulation, often leaves no marks on bone. It damages the soft structures of the neck, the cartilage, the muscles, the blood vessels, but unless the hyoid bone is fractured, which does not always occur, the skeleton may show no evidence of the cause of death at all. This was the case with most of the West Mesa victims. Their bones could tell investigators how old they were, how tall they had been, whether they had suffered previous injuries. But the bones could not say how they had died, and without a definitive cause of death, it was impossible to say with certainty that all 11 women had been killed in the same manner, by the same person, using the same method. This ambiguity extended to the question of whether the West Mesa deaths were even the work of a single killer. The assumption, from the moment the bodies were discovered, had been that this was a serial murder case, that one person had systematically targeted these women over a period of years, killed them, and buried them in the same location. The evidence supported this assumption in several important ways. The victims shared a common profile. They were young women who had been involved in sex work and substance abuse. They had disappeared from the same general area of Albuquerque, and they had been buried in close proximity to one another at a location that suggested a deliberate, repeated choice of disposal site. But there were also factors that complicated the picture. The victims had not all disappeared in a neat chronological sequence. There were gaps between some of the disappearances and clusters around certain dates. The burial site, while concentrated, was not perfectly organized. The remains were scattered across an area large enough to suggest that the burials had occurred at different times and possibly under different conditions, and the lack of forensic evidence connecting any single individual to all 11 victims meant that the single killer theory, while plausible, could not be definitively confirmed. Some investigators privately entertained the possibility that more than one killer was involved. The East Central Corridor was a dangerous place, and the women who worked there were exposed to multiple predators, not just one. It was conceivable that 2 or more individuals had independently targeted women from the same area and disposed of their bodies in the same stretch of desert. The West Mesa was, after all, a known dumping ground. Other bodies had been found in the area over the years, unrelated to the 11 victims. The desert was where Albuquerque's unwanted ended up, and it was not impossible that multiple killers had used the same location for the same purpose. This theory was never publicly embraced by the task force, but it circulated among investigators and was discussed in internal meetings. The difficulty was that it was essentially unprovable. If one killer was hard to identify, 2 or more would be nearly impossible, especially given the degraded state of the evidence. While the forensic team continued its work and the detectives pursued the Montoya lead, another aspect of the investigation was taking shape, one that was less about evidence and more about the community's response to the discovery. The families of the victims, who had spent years being ignored and dismissed, suddenly found themselves at the center of a media firestorm. Reporters wanted interviews. Camera crews showed up at their doors. The story of the West Mesa bone collector, a name that had been coined by the media and that the families despised, because it reduced their loved ones to objects, to things that had been collected rather than people who had been murdered, was national news. For the families, this attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they were grateful that the world was finally paying attention to what had happened to their daughters and sisters and mothers. On the other hand, the coverage was often sensationalized, focused on the lurid details of the burial site rather than the humanity of the victims. The women were frequently described in terms of their addictions and their involvement in Seb's work, as though these facts defined them entirely, as though the totality of their existence could be reduced to the worst moments of their lives. Dorothy Elks, Cinnamon's mother, pushed back against this narrative with a ferocity that was both admirable and heartbreaking. In interview after interview, she insisted that her daughter was more than a statistic, more than a cautionary tale, more than the sum of her struggles. Cinnamon had been a little girl who loved horses. She had been a daughter who laughed at her mother's jokes and helped set the table for dinner. She had been a human being with dreams and fears and a capacity for love that her addiction could not extinguish. Dorothy demanded that the media tell the whole story, not just the parts that made for dramatic headlines. She demanded that the police treat her daughter's murder with the same seriousness they would have brought to the murder of a doctor or a lawyer or a college student. She demanded justice, and she was not alone. The other families rallied around each other, forming an informal support network that provided comfort and, increasingly, a unified voice that could not be ignored. The community response extended beyond the families. Advocacy groups for sex workers and people experiencing addiction spoke out about the systemic failures that had allowed the West Mesa killer to operate undetected for so long. They pointed out that the Albuquerque Police Department had been aware for years that women were disappearing from East Central Avenue, and that the department's response had been, at best, inadequate. There had been no task force. There had been no pattern analysis. There had been no proactive effort to identify and apprehend a potential serial predator. The women of East Central had been left to fend for themselves, and 11 of them had paid for that neglect with their lives. These advocates called for systemic reform, better training for officers who interacted with vulnerable populations, dedicated resources for investigating crimes against sex workers, and a fundamental shift in the way that law enforcement viewed and responded to violence against marginalized communities. The Albuquerque Police Department, for its part, was defensive. Officials pointed out that the department was understaffed and underfunded, that it dealt with an enormous volume of crime, and that the resources available for investigating missing person cases were limited. They argued that the victims' lifestyles made them difficult to track, that the women moved frequently, changed names, and were often reluctant to interact with law enforcement. These were not entirely unreasonable points, but they rang hollow in the context of 11 dead women buried in a mass grave. The department's critics noted that other cities with similar challenges had managed to identify serial predators operating in their communities, that Seattle had caught the Green River Killer, that Los Angeles had caught the Grim Sleeper, that these cases had required years of dedicated effort and resources, but they had been solved. The implication was clear. Albuquerque had failed because it had not tried hard enough, because it had not cared enough, because the lives of the women on East Central Avenue had not been valued highly enough to warrant the kind of sustained, intensive investigation that might have stopped the killing before 11 women were dead. This criticism was painful for the detectives working the case, many of whom were genuinely dedicated to finding the killer and genuinely anguished by the difficulty of the investigation. The task force worked long hours, followed hundreds of leads, and pursued every viable avenue of inquiry. But the case was in many ways an investigator's nightmare. The evidence was old and degraded. The crime scenes, both the burial site and the locations where the women had last been seen, had been contaminated by years of exposure and human activity. The witness pool was small, unreliable, and often hostile to law enforcement. Many of the people who might have had information about the killer were themselves involved in illegal activities and were unwilling to talk to the police. And the one suspect who had emerged as the strongest candidate was dead, beyond the reach of interrogation or prosecution. Despite these challenges, the investigation did produce leads beyond Lorenzo Montoya. Detectives looked at every known sex offender in the Albuquerque area. They examined unsolved murders in other jurisdictions, looking for cases that might share characteristics with the West Mesa killings. They reviewed thousands of tips from the public, some of which were credible and many of which were not, and they identified a second person of interest, a man whose name would become nearly as prominent in the investigation as Montoya's, and whose story would add yet another layer of complexity and frustration to an already impossibly tangled case. His name was Ron Irwin, and unlike Lorenzo Montoya, Ron Irwin was very much alive. Ronald Lee Irwin was a convicted sex offender who had lived in Albuquerque during the period when the West Mesa victims disappeared. He was in his 50s, a large man with a thick build and a record of violent crimes against women that stretched back decades. Irwin had served time in prison for kidnapping and sexual assault, and he had been on the sex offender registry since his release. What drew the attention of the West Mesa Task Force was not just his criminal history, but his specific connection to the area where the victims had worked and the time period during which they had vanished. Irwin had lived near East Central Avenue in the early 2000s. He had been known to frequent the motels and businesses along the strip, and, most importantly, he had a connection to at least one of the victims, a connection that investigators believed was significant, though the exact nature of that connection has never been fully disclosed to the public. What has been disclosed is that Irwin owned property in the general area of the West Mesa, and that he had the means and the opportunity to transport bodies to the burial site. He also had a van, a detail that investigators found particularly interesting, because several witnesses had reported seeing a van in the area of the West Mesa around the time when some of the victims were believed to have been killed. The task force obtained search warrants for Irwin's property and vehicle. They collected DNA samples. They executed a meticulous search of his van, his home, and a storage unit he had rented. They interviewed people who had known him, people who had worked with him, people who had feared him. The investigation into Ron Irwin was thorough and sustained, spanning months of work by multiple detectives. But in the end, the evidence was not sufficient to charge him. The DA did not match. The physical evidence recovered from his property and vehicle could not be definitively linked to any of the victims. And while Irwin's criminal history and his proximity to the victims made him a compelling suspect, compelling is not the same as provable. Ron Irwin would remain a person of interest in the West Mesa case for years, and his name would surface repeatedly in media coverage and public discussions of the investigation. He would eventually be arrested and imprisoned on charges unrelated to the West Mesa murders, charges involving the assault of other women, and he would die in prison in 2020 without ever having been formally charged in connection with the 11 deaths. Whether he was the West Mesa killer, or one of the West Mesa killers, or simply a violent man who happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time, is a question that remains unanswered to this day. The investigation's focus on Montoya and Irwin, while understandable, also had the effect of narrowing the public's perception of the case. In the media, the story became about two suspects, one dead, one alive but uncharged, and the frustrating inability of law enforcement to close the case. But within the task force, the investigative landscape was far broader than the public realized. Detectives were looking at dozens of potential suspects, not just two. They were examining the possibility that the killer was someone who had no prior criminal record, someone who had never come to the attention of law enforcement, someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. They were also grappling with a question that haunted every aspect of the investigation: had the killing stopped? Or had the killer simply changed his methods or his location? The West Mesa victims had disappeared between 2001 and 2005. The bodies had been discovered in 2009. In the years between the last known disappearance and the discovery of the burial site, there had been no new cases that clearly matched the pattern of the West Mesa killings. No new cluster of missing women from East Central Avenue. No new burial sites discovered in the desert. This could have meant several things. It could have meant that the killer was dead, that Lorenzo Montoya, killed in 2006, had been the perpetrator, and that his death had brought the killing to an end. It could have meant that the killer was in prison, that Ron Irwin or some other individual had been incarcerated for unrelated crimes during this period, effectively preventing them from killing again. Or it could have meant that the killer had simply moved on, had left Albuquerque or changed his hunting grounds, or refined his methods to the point where his victims were no longer being found. This last possibility was the most disturbing, and it was the one that kept the detectives up at night. A serial killer who has learned from experience, who has adapted his methods in response to changing circumstances, who has become more careful and more sophisticated over time, is the most dangerous kind of predator. If the West Mesa killer had not stopped but had simply gotten better at hiding his crimes, then there could be more victims, women who had disappeared from other cities, other states, whose bodies lay in other unmarked graves, waiting to be found. The task force quietly reached out to law enforcement agencies in other parts of the country, sharing information about the West Mesa case and asking whether any similar patterns had been observed. Some of these inquiries produced leads that were worth pursuing. Others led nowhere. The vast, interconnected network of missing person databases and unsolved murder files is both a resource and a labyrinth, and navigating it in search of a single killer's trail is a task that can consume years of effort without producing a definitive result. Meanwhile, the families waited. They held vigils. They marked anniversaries. They attended community events where the names of the 11 women were read aloud and candles were lit in their memory. They pressured the police department for updates, for progress, for any scrap of information that might suggest the case was moving forward. And they lived with the knowing, ever-present knowledge that the person who had killed their loved ones might still be free, might still be walking the streets, might still be capable of killing again. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was immense. For the families, the discovery of the bodies had provided a kind of closure, but it had also opened a new wound, the wound of knowing, in graphic and specific terms, what had happened to the people they loved. Before the discovery, they could tell themselves stories. Maybe she left the city. Maybe she started a new life somewhere. Maybe she is alive and well and just does not want to be found. These were painful stories, but they were stories that allowed for hope. After the discovery, hope was gone. In its place was the brutal reality of bones in the desert, of a loved one who had been murdered and discarded like refuse. And overlaying that reality was the ongoing injustice of an unsolved case, of a killer who had not been held accountable, of a system that had failed to protect these women in life and was now struggling to find justice for them in death. Victoria Chavez, Michelle Valdez's mother, described the experience in terms that are difficult to hear. She said that losing Michelle the first time, when she disappeared, had been like having her heart ripped out. But finding out that Michelle had been murdered and buried in the desert was like having that heart ripped out a second time, and then being told that no one knew who had done it, and that no one might ever know. She said she could not sleep. She said she saw Michelle's face in every crowd, heard her voice in every room. She said the grief was not something that faded with time, but something that intensified, that grew heavier and more suffocating with each passing year. She said she wanted to forgive the person who had killed her daughter, because she believed that forgiveness was the only path to peace. But she could not forgive someone who had not been identified, who had not been caught, who had not been made to answer for what he had done. The absence of justice was a barrier to healing that no amount of prayer or therapy or community support could overcome. Dorothy Elks expressed similar sentiments, but with a sharper edge. She was angry. She was angry at the killer, whoever he was. She was angry at the police, who she believed had not done enough to protect her daughter, and the other women on East Central. She was angry at the community, which she felt had looked the other way while vulnerable women were being preyed upon. And she was angry at a society that valued some lives over others, that lavished attention and resources on some victims while dismissing others as disposable. Dorothy channeled her anger into advocacy. She spoke at city council meetings. She organized marches. She appeared on television news programs and demanded accountability. She became a symbol of the family's refusal to let the West Mesa case be forgotten. A reminder that behind every cold case file is a mother who cannot stop searching for answers. The other families coped in their own ways. Some withdrew from public life, unable to bear the constant media attention and the reopening of old wounds. Some found comfort in religion, in the belief that their loved ones were at peace and that justice would come. If not in this life, then in the next. Some turned to each other, finding strength in the shared experience of loss and the mutual understanding that only another grieving parent or sibling or child could provide. And some simply endured, putting one foot in front of the other, getting through each day as best they could, carrying a weight that never got lighter. As months turned into years without an arrest, the West Mesa case began to fade from the headlines. This is the natural trajectory of unsolved cases. They burn bright in the public consciousness for a time, fueled by media coverage and community outrage, and then they cool and dim as other stories take their place. By 2011, 2 years after the discovery, the West Mesa murders were no longer front-page news in Albuquerque. By 2013, they were rarely mentioned at all. The task force continued to operate, but at a reduced capacity. Detectives were reassigned to other cases, resources were redirected. The investigation did not stop, but it slowed to a pace that reflected the diminished priority the case now occupied in the department's hierarchy. The families noticed this change, and they were not silent about it. They accused the department of giving up, of abandoning their loved ones a second time. The department denied this, insisting that the case remained open and active, that detectives were still pursuing leads, that the investigation would continue for as long as it took to find the killer. But the families were not convinced. They had been through this before. They had been told that their daughters' disappearances were being investigated, and they had watched as those investigations went nowhere. They had been told that the West Mesa discovery would bring answers, and they had watched as the answers failed to materialize. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired, and the trust between the families and the Albuquerque Police Department had been broken long before the bodies were found. In the midst of this slow fade, a development occurred that briefly reignited public interest in the case and sent shockwaves through the investigative team. In 2014, a confidential informant came forward with information that, if true, could have blown the case wide open. The informant, whose identity has never been publicly revealed, claimed to have first-hand knowledge of the West Mesa killings. The informant said that the murders had been committed by a group of individuals, not a single killer, and that the motive was connected to the drug trade rather than sexual predation. According to this account, the women had been killed because they had witnessed or been involved in drug transactions that certain powerful people wanted kept secret. The burials on the West Mesa had been a way of eliminating witnesses and sending a message to others who might be tempted to talk. This theory was not entirely new. It had circulated on the fringes of the investigation for years, whispered about by people in the drug world who claimed to know more than they were willing to tell. But the 2014 informant was the first person to present it in a detailed, specific, and potentially verifiable form. The informant provided names, dates, and locations. The task force took the information seriously and devoted significant resources to investigating it. Detectives conducted surveillance, executed search warrants, and interviewed dozens of people connected to the individuals named by the informant. The results were inconclusive. Some elements of the informant's account were corroborated by independent evidence. Others could not be verified, and some details directly contradicted the established facts of the case. The informant's credibility was also called into question. The person had a criminal history and a possible motive for providing false or misleading information. In the end, the task force was unable to build a prosecutable case based on the informant's account, and the lead, while never formally closed, was deprioritized in favor of other avenues of investigation. This episode illustrated one of the most frustrating aspects of the West Mesa case: the abundance of theories and the scarcity of proof. Over the years, dozens of theories had been proposed, some by law enforcement professionals and some by armchair detectives and true crime enthusiasts. The single killer theory, the multiple killer theory, the drug conspiracy theory. The theory that the killer was a long-haul trucker who had passed through Albuquerque regularly and had used the West Mesa as a convenient disposal site. The theory that the killer was a police officer, someone with intimate knowledge of the department's investigative procedures and the ability to avoid detection. Each theory had its adherents, and each could point to certain facts that supported it, but none could be proven. The West Mesa was a puzzle with too many pieces missing, and the picture that emerged from the available pieces was too blurry and too fragmented to resolve into a clear image. The blurriness of the picture did not stop people from looking. If anything, it intensified the scrutiny. The West Mesa case had, by the mid-2010s, become one of the most discussed unsolved serial murder cases in America. It attracted the attention of journalists, podcasters, documentary filmmakers, and independent researchers who believed that the key to solving the case lay in some overlooked detail, some unexplored connection, some piece of evidence that had been misinterpreted or dismissed. The internet, with its capacity for obsessive collective analysis, became a second investigative arena, one that operated in parallel with the official task force, but was governed by different rules and different standards of evidence. Online forums dedicated to the case sprang up, populated by people who pored over public records, court documents, news articles, and satellite images, searching for the thread that would unravel the mystery. Some of this amateur investigation was thoughtful and well-reasoned. Some of it was reckless and irresponsible, fueled by speculation and conspiracy thinking, and some of it caused real harm, as innocent people were accused of involvement in the murders, based on nothing more than proximity and conjecture. One of the names that surfaced repeatedly in these online discussions was that of a man named Joseph Blee. Blee was a convicted serial rapist who had lived in Albuquerque during the period of the West Mesa killings. His criminal history was extensive and horrifying. He had been convicted of multiple sexual assaults spanning decades, crimes that had gone undetected for years because his victims, like the West Mesa victims, were marginalized women whose reports were not taken seriously by law enforcement. Blee had operated in the same neighborhoods, targeted the same vulnerable populations, and displayed the same pattern of escalating violence that criminologists associate with serial killers. When his name emerged in connection with the West Mesa case, it seemed, to many observers, like a more plausible suspect than either Montoya or Irwin. The connection between Blee and the West Mesa was not merely circumstantial. Investigators discovered that Blee had known at least some of the victims. He had been a presence in the world of East Central Avenue, a man who moved through that ecosystem with familiarity and ease. He had a vehicle capable of transporting bodies. He had knowledge of the West Mesa area, and his pattern of sexual violence, which included abduction, restraint, and strangulation, was consistent with the suspected method of killing in the West Mesa case. When Blee was finally arrested in 2010 for a series of dating back to the 1980s and 1990s, the task force took a close look at him as a potential suspect in the West Mesa murders. The investigation into Blee was extensive. Detectives reviewed his criminal history, his movements during the period of the killings, his associations, and his access to the West Mesa. They obtained DNA samples and compared them to any genetic material that had been recovered from the burial site. They interviewed his surviving victims, asking whether Blee had ever mentioned the West Mesa, whether he had ever taken them to isolated locations, whether he had ever displayed behavior that might suggest he was capable of murder on this scale. The surviving victims painted a picture of a man who was calculating, sadistic, and utterly without empathy. He selected his victims carefully, choosing women who were unlikely to be believed if they reported the assault. He used threats and violence to ensure their silence, and he demonstrated a level of planning and control that suggested he was capable of sustained, methodical criminal activity over long periods of time. But once again, the investigation hit a wall. The DNA evidence did not produce a match. The forensic analysis of the burial site had yielded limited genetic material, and what had been recovered was too degraded to provide the kind of definitive linkage that would be necessary for a prosecution. Blee's movements during the period of the killings could not be pinpointed with enough precision to place him at the burial site at the relevant times. And while his criminal history was damning, it was not proof that he had committed these specific murders. A history of rape, even serial rape, does not automatically make someone a serial killer, and the task force was careful not to conflate the two. Blee was convicted of his rape charges and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars for those crimes that were themselves a monument to systemic failure. He had raped women for decades without being caught, operating in the same shadows that the West Mesa killer had exploited. But he was never charged in connection with the West Mesa murders, and the question of his involvement remained, like so much else in this case, an open wound. The parade of suspects, Montoya Irwin, Blee and others whose names were less prominent but no less investigated, created a strange dynamic in the public perception of the case. On one hand, the existence of multiple credible suspects suggested that the police were making progress, that the net was tightening, that an arrest was possible if not imminent. On the other hand, the failure to charge any of these suspects reinforced the growing sense that the case might never be solved, that the evidence was too thin, the trail too cold, the obstacles too great. Each new suspect who was investigated and cleared, or, more accurately, not cleared but not charged, chipped away at the public's confidence that justice would be served. And each passing year added another layer of distance between the crimes and any possibility of resolution. By 2015, 6 years after the discovery, the West Mesa case had settled into a kind of grim stasis. The task force still existed, at least on paper, but its operational capacity had been reduced to a handful of detectives who divided their time between the West Mesa case and other active investigations. The forensic evidence had been analyzed and reanalyzed, subjected to every available technology, and the results were what they were, insufficient to support a prosecution. The witness pool had shrunk further as people moved away, died, or simply became unwilling to revisit painful memories. The families continued to advocate, continued to demand answers, but their voices, once amplified by the urgency of the discovery, were now muffled by the passage of time and the public's limited attention span. It was during this period of stasis that the broader implications of the West Mesa case began to come into sharper focus. The case was no longer just about 11 women and one killer. It had become a symbol of something larger, a lens through which deeper truths about American society could be examined. The conversation shifted from the specifics of the investigation to the systemic failures that had made the murders possible. And the questions being asked were no longer about who had killed these women, but about why their deaths had been allowed to happen. The concept of the less dead became central to this conversation. The term, coined by criminologist Stephen Egger, refers to victims who receive less attention from law enforcement and the media because of their social status. Sex workers, people experiencing homelessness, people struggling with addiction, undocumented immigrants. These are the populations from which serials have historically drawn their victims, precisely because their disappearances are less likely to trigger an aggressive investigative response. The West Mesa case was a textbook illustration of this dynamic. The 11 victims had been, in Egger's terminology, less dead. Their lives had been deemed less valuable by the systems that should have protected them, and their deaths had been treated as less urgent by the institutions that should have investigated them. The fact that a serial killer had been able to operate in Albuquerque for years, killing women at a rate of roughly 2 or 3 per year, without being detected or even suspected, was not primarily a failure of detective work. It was a failure of values. It was a reflection of a society that had decided, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that certain lives do not matter as much as others. This critique resonated far beyond Albuquerque. Across the country, similar cases were coming to light. Cases in which serial predators had targeted marginalized victims and had gone undetected for years or decades because the victims' disappearances had not been taken seriously. The Grim Sleeper case in Los Angeles, in which a serial killer had murdered at least 10 women over a 25 period, shared many of the same characteristics as the West Mesa case. The victims were predominantly African American women from South Los Angeles, many of whom had been involved in sex work or substance abuse. Their disappearances had been noted by their families, but largely ignored by law enforcement and the media. The killer had been able to operate for a quarter of a century, taking breaks and resuming his activities at will, because no one in a position of power had recognized or prioritized the pattern of disappearances. The parallels between the two cases were striking and deeply troubling. They suggested that the problem was not unique to Albuquerque, not the result of some specific local failure, but rather a systemic issue embedded in the way American law enforcement and American society responded to violence against marginalized populations. The question was not why the Albuquerque Police Department had failed to detect the West Mesa killer. But why police departments across the country consistently failed to detect serial predators who targeted vulnerable victims? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, pointed to institutional biases that prioritized certain victims over others, resource allocation decisions that left marginalized communities underserved, and cultural attitudes that blamed victims for their own vulnerability. In Albuquerque, this reckoning took concrete form. The West Mesa case prompted a series of reforms within the police department and the broader criminal justice system. A new protocol was established for handling missing person cases involving individuals engaged in sex work or substance abuse, requiring that these cases receive the same level of investigative attention as any other missing person case. A dedicated unit was created to monitor patterns of violence along East Central Avenue, with the goal of identifying potential serial predators before they could accumulate a body count. And outreach programs were expanded, providing support services to women working on the streets, including access to drug treatment, housing assistance, and legal aid. These reforms were welcome, but they were also bittersweet. They came too late for Monica Candelaria, for Cinnamon Elks, for Michelle Valdez, for Jamie Barala, for Doreen Marquez, for Evelyn Salazar, for Veronica Romero, for Julie Nieto, for Sylvia Hutton, for Virginia Cloven, for Jessica Roybal. They came too late for the unborn child, whose remains had been found among those of the 11 women, a child who had never drawn a breath, whose entire existence had been contained within the body of a mother who was herself a victim. These reforms were an acknowledgement of failure, an attempt to ensure that the same failure would not be repeated. But for the families, acknowledgments and reforms were poor substitutes for the one thing they wanted most: accountability. Someone had killed their loved ones, and that someone had not been held to account. The question of accountability extended beyond the killer. The families and their advocates argued that the Albuquerque Police Department bore a measure of responsibility for the deaths, not because the officers had committed the murders, but because their negligence had created the conditions in which the murders could occur. If the department had investigated the disappearances more aggressively, if it had recognized the pattern earlier, if it had devoted the necessary resources to protecting the women of East Central Avenue, then some or all of the victims might still be alive. This argument was not merely rhetorical. In 2010, several of the families filed a lawsuit against the city of Albuquerque, alleging that the police department's failure to investigate the disappearances constituted negligence and a violation of the victims' civil rights. The lawsuit was a long shot. Proving that law enforcement negligence directly caused a murder is an extremely high legal bar, but it was a measure of the family's desperation and their determination to hold someone, anyone, accountable for what had happened. The lawsuit wound its way through the courts over the following years, generating media attention and legal arguments, but ultimately producing no definitive resolution. The city contested the claims, arguing that the police department had acted within the bounds of its resources and its discretion, and that the murders were the sole responsibility of the unknown killer. The legal proceedings were complicated by the same evidentiary challenges that had plagued the criminal investigation. Without a clear understanding of who the killer was, when the murders had occurred, and what the police had known or should have known at the time, it was difficult to establish the causal link between the department's actions and the victims' deaths. The case would drag on for years, a parallel track of frustration and disappointment that mirrored the criminal investigation in its inability to reach a satisfying conclusion. While the legal battle played out, the city of Albuquerque wrestled with the question of how to memorialize the victims. This was a more contentious issue than one might expect. The West Mesa burial site had been thoroughly excavated and returned to its previous state, a flat, featureless stretch of desert that gave no outward indication of the horror that had been unearthed there. The planned housing development that had led to the discovery of the bodies was never completed. The land sat empty, a vacant lot at the edge of a growing city, its significance known only to those who remembered what had been found there. The families wanted a permanent memorial, something that would mark the spot and honor the victims. They wanted the world to know that this was not just empty desert, that this was hallowed ground, that 11 women and one unborn child had been found here, and that their lives and their deaths mattered. The city was initially slow to respond. There were logistical questions. Who would fund the memorial? Where exactly it should be located? What form it should take? There were also more delicate concerns, particularly from developers who worried that a memorial would depress property values in an area that was being eyed for future construction. These concerns struck the families as obscene. The idea that commercial interests might take precedence over the memory of the dead was an affront that deepened their already profound distrust of the institutions that governed their city. Dorothy Elks, characteristically, did not mince words. She told reporters that her daughter's body had been found on that land, that the land was soaked with her daughter's blood, and that no amount of concrete and drywall could wash that away. She said that if the city could not find it in its heart to build a memorial, then the families would build one themselves, on their own time and with their own money, and the city could explain to the world why it had refused to honor 11 murdered women. The public pressure eventually produced results. In the years following the discovery, a memorial was established near the burial site, a simple dignified marker with the names of the 11 victims, surrounded by a small garden. It was not grand. It was not elaborate. But it was there, a physical acknowledgement that these women had existed, that they had been loved, and that their deaths demanded remembrance. The families gathered there on anniversaries, leaving flowers and photographs and handwritten notes. The memorial became a place of pilgrimage for the true crime community as well, for people who had followed the case and who wanted to pay their respects. And it became, in a quiet way, a symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice, a reminder that the case was not closed, that the killer had not been found, that the dead were still waiting for someone to speak their names and say, "Finally, this is who took them from us." The memorial also served as a gathering point for the families during moments of renewed hope, which came intermittently and without warning over the years. In 2016, the Albuquerque Police Department announced that it was submitting evidence from the West Mesa case for advanced DNA analysis using new genetic genealogy techniques. This was the technology that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in California in 2018. A breakthrough that had sent shockwaves through the world of cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy uses DNA evidence to build a family tree, identifying the suspect not through a direct match in a criminal database, but through their genetic relatives who have submitted their DNA to commercial genealogy services. The technique had proven extraordinarily effective in cases where traditional DNA analysis had failed, and the West Mesa families were cautiously optimistic that it might finally provide the answer they had been seeking. The DNA analysis was a complex and time-consuming process. The genetic material recovered from the West Mesa burial site was limited and degraded, and extracting usable profiles from it required sophisticated laboratory work that could not be rushed. The task force worked with outside experts, including forensic geneticists and genealogy researchers who had been involved in other profile cold case identifications. The process took months, and the families waited with a mix of hope and dread, hope that the analysis would produce a name, and dread that it would not, that even this cutting-edge technology would fail to penetrate the wall of silence that had protected the killer for so long. The results, when they came, were not what the families had hoped for. The DNA analysis produced partial profiles that were potentially useful, but not sufficient to generate a definitive identification. The degradation of the genetic material, combined with the complexities of the burial environment, the heat, the moisture, the microbial activity in the soil, had taken too great a toll. The profiles that were obtained were entered into genealogical databases and compared against millions of records, but no match was found. The technology that had cracked the Golden State Killer case, that had given so many families across the country the answers they had been waiting for, was not able to unlock the West Mesa mystery. The disappointment was crushing. The families had allowed themselves to hope, and hope in the context of this case was a dangerous thing. But the DNA analysis was not a complete failure. While it did not produce an identification, It did narrow the field of possible suspects. The partial profiles could be used to exclude certain individuals, and they provided a baseline against which future DNA evidence could be compared. The task force emphasized that the investigation was ongoing, that new techniques were being developed all the time, and that the evidence would be resubmitted for analysis as these techniques became available. This was true, and it was not mere rhetoric. Advances in forensic technology were occurring at an unprecedented pace, and cases that had been considered unsolvable a decade ago were being cracked with increasing frequency. The West Mesa families clung to this knowledge, fragile as it was, and they continued to wait. The waiting was per the cruelest aspect of the entire ordeal. Grief, in its natural course, moves through stages. There is shock and anger and bargaining and depression, and eventually something that resembles acceptance. But the families of the West Mesa victims were denied this natural progression. Their grief was frozen, suspended in a state of perpetual uncertainty. They could not fully mourn because the story was not over. They could not find closure because the case was not closed. They could not move on because the past kept pulling them back. Every anniversary, every news report, every tip that led nowhere, every suspect who was investigated and not charged. The wound was never allowed to heal because it was constantly being reopened, and the pain, far from diminishing over time, seemed to deepen and intensify with each passing year. The children of the victims were most affected by this ongoing trauma. Michelle Valdez's son, who had been a toddler when his mother disappeared, grew up knowing that his mother had been murdered and that her had never been caught. He grew up with questions that no one could answer. Why had his mother been taken, who had done it, and why had no one been able to find the person responsible? These questions shaped his childhood and his adolescence in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend. He was not the only child affected. Several of the victims had been mothers, and their children were raised by grandparents, aunts, uncles, and foster families who did their best to provide stability and love, but who could not replace what had been lost. These children carried the weight of their mothers' deaths in ways that were both visible and invisible, in their behavior, in their relationships, in their sense of safety and trust in the world. They were the secondary victims of the West Mesa murders, casualties of a crime that had rippled outward through time and touched lives that the killer had probably never considered. The ripple effect extended to the broader community as well. The women who continued to work on East Central Avenue after the discovery lived in heightened fear. They knew that a killer had stalked these streets, had picked up women just like them, had taken them to the desert and buried them in shallow graves. And they knew that this killer had not been caught. Every car that slowed down, every stranger who made eye contact, every moment of silence in a motel room became charged with a terror that was both specific and existential. Some women left the streets altogether, driven by fear to seek other means of survival. Others stayed, because the forces that had put them on the streets, place, addiction, poverty, lack of alternatives, were stronger than their fear. They adopted new safety measures, traveling in pairs, sharing information about dangerous clients, memorizing license plate numbers. But they knew, in the way that people who live with constant danger always know, that these measures were imperfect, that the next car that pulled over might contain someone who meant them harm, and that the desert was wide and dark and very, very patient. The patience of the desert was matched only by the patience of the families, and by the slow, grinding persistence of the detectives who refused to let the case die completely. Even as the task force shrank and the media moved on, a small core of investigators remained committed to the West Mesa case. These were men and women who had been with the investigation from the beginning, who had stood in the dirt as the bones were unearthed, who had knocked on doors and sat across from weeping mothers and stared at photographs of young women who would never grow old. The case had gotten under their skin in a way that other cases had not, and they carried it with them, not just as a professional obligation but as a personal one. They knew the victims' names by heart. They knew the details of their lives, their families, their struggles. They had memorized the geography of the burial site, the layout of the graves, the position of each body relative to the others, and they believed, with a conviction that bordered on faith, that the answer was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. One of the detectives who remained most deeply invested in the case was Ida Lopez. Detective Lopez had been assigned to the missing persons unit of the Albuquerque Police Department before the West Mesa discovery, and she had been one of the few people in the department who had recognized that something was wrong on East Central Avenue before the bodies were found. In the years leading up to the discovery, Lopez had noticed a pattern in the missing person reports that crossed her desk: young women involved in sex work disappearing from the same area, with no trace and no explanation. She had tried to raise the alarm, had attempted to draw attention to the clustering of disappearances, but her concerns had been met with indifference. The department was overwhelmed with cases, and the missing sex workers of East Central were not a priority. Lopez had been frustrated but not defeated. She had continued to track the disappearances, building a file that would prove eerily prescient when the West Mesa graves were opened. After the discovery, Lopez became a central figure in the investigation. Her knowledge of the missing women, her relationships with the families, and her understanding of the East Central community made her an invaluable asset to the task force. She conducted hundreds of interviews, spent countless hours reviewing evidence, and served as the primary liaison between the department and the victims' families. The families trusted her in a way they trusted few other members of law enforcement, because she had been paying attention when no one else was, because she had treated their loved ones as human beings worthy of concern, when the rest of the system had treated them as disposable. Lopez's dedication to the case was extraordinary, and it came at a significant personal cost. She worked long hours, sacrificed time with her own family, and absorbed the emotional weight of the investigation in a way that took a toll on her health and her well-being. But she did not stop. She could not stop. The 11 women had become her responsibility, and she would not abandon them. Lopez was not alone in her dedication. Other members of the task force, including senior detectives and forensic specialists, continued to work the case with quiet determination. They revisited old evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and explored new investigative avenues as they became available. One area of focus in the later years of the investigation was the analysis of cell phone records. In the early 2000s, when the victims had disappeared, cell phone technology was less ubiquitous than it would later become, but some of the victims had possessed mobile phones, and records of their calls and their phones' locations could potentially be reconstructed. The task force obtained court orders for historical cell tower data, attempting to map the victims' movements in the days and hours before their disappearances. This was painstaking work, complicated by the age of the records and the limitations of the technology at the time. Cell tower data from the early 2000s was less precise than modern location tracking, and the records were often incomplete or had been purged by the phone companies in accordance with their data retention policies. But the effort produced some useful information, including a clearer picture of the victims' patterns of movement and communication, which in turn helped investigators to identify potential witnesses and narrow the timeframes in which the women had likely been taken. Another avenue of investigation that received renewed attention in the later years was the analysis of vehicle records. The task force had long believed that the killer had used a vehicle to transport the victims' bodies to the West Mesa, and that identifying that vehicle could be the key to identifying the killer. Investigators obtained records of vehicle registrations, traffic citations, and parking violations in the areas surrounding both East Central Avenue and the West Mesa during the period of the killings. They cross-referenced these records with the names of known suspects and persons of interest, looking for a vehicle that appeared in both locations during the relevant timeframes. This was a massive data analysis project, involving tens of thousands of records and requiring the development of custom software tools to manage the volume of information. The results were suggestive but not conclusive. Several vehicles of interest were identified, but none could be definitively linked to the killer. The task force also explored the possibility that the killer had been captured on surveillance footage. In the early 2000s, security cameras were less prevalent than they are today. But some businesses along East Central Avenue and in the areas surrounding the West Mesa had cameras that might have recorded the killer's vehicle or even the killer himself. The challenge was that any footage that might have existed had almost certainly been recorded over or destroyed in the years since the killings. Video surveillance systems in that era typically stored footage for a limited period, days or weeks, not years, and the chances of recovering recordings from a decade or more in the past were slim. Nevertheless, the task force made inquiries, contacted businesses, and searched for any surviving footage that might be relevant. A small amount of material was recovered, mostly from businesses that had upgraded their surveillance systems and had, either intentionally or accidentally, preserved old recordings on archived hard drives. The footage was of poor quality and limited scope, and while it provided some context for the activities along East Central during the period of the killings, it did not capture anything that could be directly linked to the murders. These investigative efforts, while individually inconclusive, collectively contributed to a deeper understanding of the case and a more complete picture of the environment in which the killings had occurred. The task force assembled a detailed profile of the killer, or killers, based on the totality of the evidence. The profile described someone who was familiar with the East Central Avenue area and its population of vulnerable women. Someone who had a vehicle, probably a van or a truck, capable of transporting a body without attracting attention. Someone who knew the West Mesa well enough to navigate to the burial site in the dark, across unpaved roads and open desert. Someone who was physically capable of digging graves and moving dead weight. Someone who was patient, methodical, and controlled. Not a disorganized killer who acted on impulse, but a planner who selected his victims, chose his disposal site, and executed his crimes with a level of care that suggested experience and confidence, and someone who was either embedded in the community deeply enough to avoid suspicion, or isolated enough to operate without close scrutiny. The profile was useful as a framework, but it was also broad enough to encompass a large number of potential suspects, and it did not point to any single individual with the specificity necessary for an arrest. As the investigation continued its slow, methodical progress, the case also became a subject of academic study. Criminologists, sociologists, and forensic scientists examined the West Mesa murders as a case study in serial predation, law enforcement response, and the vulnerability of marginalized populations. Academic papers were published, conference presentations were given, and graduate students wrote dissertations analyzing various aspects of the case. This scholarly attention served a dual purpose. It advanced the general understanding of serial crime and its societal context, and it kept the West Mesa case in the professional consciousness of the law enforcement and forensic science communities, ensuring that new developments in technology and methodology would be applied to the case as they emerged. One of the most significant academic contributions came from the field of geographic profiling, a technique developed by criminologist Kim Rossmo that uses the spatial distribution of crime sites to estimate the probable location of a serial offender's home or base of operations. Geographic profiling had been used successfully in a number of serial crime investigations, and when it was applied to the West Mesa case, it produced a probability map that centered on the East Central Corridor, specifically the area between San Mateo Boulevard and Louisiana Boulevard. This was consistent with the task force's existing focus on the East Central area, but did not significantly narrow the field of suspects. The geographic profile suggested that the killer lived or worked within a few miles of the intersection where Lorenzo Montoya had resided, which was interesting but not dispositive. Montoya was already dead, and the profile's probability zone encompassed a densely populated area with thousands of residents, any one of whom could theoretically have been the killer. The geographic analysis did, however, produce one insight that the task force found particularly valuable. By examining the distribution of the victims' last known locations and the position of the burial site, the profiler identified a likely travel route that the killer would have used to transport the bodies from East Central to the West Mesa. This route followed surface streets westward from the Strip, crossed the Rio Grande, and continued along a series of increasingly isolated roads until it reached the open desert. The profiler noted that this route was not the most direct path to the burial site. A more efficient road existed using a different set of roads, and speculated that the killer had deliberately chosen a less direct path to avoid areas with higher traffic density and a greater likelihood of being observed. This suggested a level of familiarity with the local road network and a degree of planning that was consistent with the task force's profile of the killer as a methodical, experienced offender. Armed with this analysis, detectives revisited the route, looking for any evidence, witnesses, surveillance cameras, physical traces that might have been overlooked in earlier phases of the investigation. They knocked on doors along the probable travel route, asking residents if they remembered seeing any unusual vehicles or activity in the early 2000s. Most people had no useful information to offer. The events in question had occurred more than a decade earlier, and memories had faded or been overwritten by the intervening years. But a few residents recalled seeing vehicles on the unpaved roads leading to the West Mesa at unusual hours, vehicles that had no obvious reason to be in the area. These accounts were vague and could not be tied to specific dates or times, but they were consistent with the theory that the killer had made multiple trips to the burial site over a period of years, and that at least some of those trips had been noticed, however fleetingly, by people in the area. The vagueness of these accounts was emblematic of a broader challenge that the investigation faced throughout its existence: the difficulty of reconstructing events that had occurred years or even decades in the past. Human memory is imperfect even under the best of circumstances, and the passage of time degrades it further. Witnesses who might have provided crucial information at the time of the killings were, by the time they were interviewed, unable to recall the details with the precision that an investigation requires. Dates blurred together, faces became indistinct. The sharp edges of memory were worn smooth by the years, leaving impressions rather than images, feelings rather than facts. The task force worked with what it had, understanding that the information was imperfect, and that the gaps could not always be filled. The imperfection of memory was compounded by the imperfection of the physical evidence. The West Mesa burial site had been thoroughly excavated and processed, but the sheer scale of the site and the condition of the remains meant that some evidence had almost certainly been missed or destroyed during the recovery process. Soil samples, for example, had been collected from the area surrounding the graves, but the volume of soil was enormous, and the resources available for analyzing it were finite. Items that had been buried with the victims, clothing, jewelry, personal effects, had been cataloged and examined, but many were too degraded to yield useful forensic information, and the possibility that additional evidence remained in the ground, beyond the boundaries of the excavation, could not be entirely ruled out. The task force considered expanding the search area on several occasions, but ultimately concluded that the resources required for expansion could not be justified given the low probability of finding additional evidence. This calculus of resources, the constant balancing of what could be done against what should be done against what the budget would allow, was a recurring theme in the investigation. The West Mesa case was expensive. The excavation alone had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The forensic analysis, the DNA testing, the detective hours, the travel, the technology, the expert consultants, all of these added up to a total that ran into the millions. The Albuquerque Police Department, already stretched thin by a rising crime rate and a shrinking budget, struggled to sustain this level of expenditure over the long term. The result was a slow but steady reduction in the resources devoted to the case, a process that the department described as prioritization and the families described as abandonment. The tension between the department and the families was a constant undercurrent in the years following the discovery. The families felt that the department was not doing enough, that it was allowing the case to go cold, that it was more concerned with managing its public image than with finding the killer. The department felt that it was doing the best it could with limited resources, that the case was genuinely difficult, and that the family's frustration, while understandable, was sometimes directed at the wrong target. These feelings were not always expressed constructively. There were heated exchanges at public meetings, angry letters to the editor, and social media posts that accused the department of incompetence and cover-up. There were also quieter, more painful moments. Phone calls between detectives and family members, in which both sides struggled to maintain composure. Conversations that ended with nothing resolved and everyone feeling worse than when they started. Ida Lopez often found herself mediating these tensions, serving as a bridge between the families and the department, absorbing anger from both sides, while trying to keep the investigation moving forward. She understood the family's pain because she shared it in her own way. She had spent years of her life on this case, had given it everything she had, and the lack of resolution was as frustrating to her as it was to the families. But she also understood the institutional constraints that limited what the department could do, the bureaucratic realities that governed resource allocation, and the legal requirements that prevented detectives from acting on suspicion alone. She walked a tightrope between empathy and pragmatism, and she walked it with a grace that earned her the respect of nearly everyone involved in the case. But even Lopez could not bridge the fundamental gap between what the families wanted and what the investigation could deliver. The families wanted an arrest. They wanted a trial. They wanted to sit in a courtroom and look into the eyes of the person who had killed their daughters and sisters and mothers. And they wanted to hear a judge pronounce a sentence that would represent, however inadequately, the value of the lives that had been taken. They wanted closure, that elusive and perhaps mythical state in which the pain of losses, if not extinguished, at least contained, placed within a narrative that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The investigation could not give them that. It could give them information, partial and incomplete. It could give them effort, genuine and sustained. It could give them the knowledge that people were still working, still searching, still refusing to give up. But it could not give them the one thing that would make the pain bearable, and the absence of that one thing colored everything else. The years between 2016 and 2020 were a period of quiet, incremental work on the case. There were no major breakthroughs, no dramatic revelations, no arrests. The task force continued to pursue leads, retest evidence, and explore new investigative technologies as they became available. The genetic genealogy work that had been initiated in 2016 was ongoing, with evidence being periodically resubmitted for analysis as the databases grew and the techniques improved. Each resubmission brought a flicker of hope, and each set of results brought a fresh wave of disappointment. The databases were growing rapidly. Millions of people were submitting their DNA to commercial genealogy services every year, and with each new entry, the chances of finding a genetic match to the West Mesa evidence improved incrementally. But incrementally was not the same as definitively, and the families learned to manage their expectations, to hope without expecting, to prepare for disappointment while remaining open to the possibility of surprise. During this period, the case also attracted the attention of several high-profile investigative journalists and documentary filmmakers who believed that a fresh look at the evidence, unencumbered by the institutional biases and resource constraints of the police department, might yield new insights. A number of articles were published in national magazines and newspapers, and at least 2 documentary projects were initiated, each seeking to re-examine the case from the ground up. These journalistic investigations brought renewed attention to the case and, in some instances, uncovered information that had not been previously reported. One journalist, through a series of public records requests, obtained internal police documents that revealed the extent to which the department had been aware of the pattern of disappearances on East Central Avenue before the West Mesa discovery. The documents showed that several officers, including Ida Lopez, had flagged the disappearances as potentially connected and had requested additional resources for investigation. These requests had been denied or deferred, and the pattern had continued unchecked until the bodies were found. The publication of these documents was explosive. They confirmed what the families had long suspected, that the department had known, or should have known, that something was happening on East Central, and that it had failed to act with the urgency that the situation demanded. The documents did not suggest a deliberate cover-up, but they did paint a picture of institutional inertia, of a bureaucracy that was slow to recognize threats, that did not fit neatly into its existing categories and priorities. The department responded to the publication with a statement acknowledging that mistakes had been made and reiterating its commitment to solving the case. The statement satisfied no one. The documentaries that were produced during this period took different approaches to the case. One focused primarily on the families, telling the story through their eyes and their voices, emphasizing the human cost of the unsolved murders and the systemic failures that had contributed to them. This project was deeply emotional, featuring extensive interviews with mothers, fathers, siblings, and children of the victims, and it served as a powerful reminder that behind the forensic evidence and the investigative minutiae were real people who were living with real pain. The other documentary took a more investigative approach, re-examining the evidence, interviewing former members of the task force, and proposing new theories about the identity of the killer. This project was more controversial, as it named individuals who had not been publicly identified as suspects and advanced theories that some observers considered speculative and potentially harmful. Both documentaries were well received by the public and contributed to a renewed wave of interest in the case. But neither produced the breakthrough that the families and the investigators were hoping for. The renewed public attention did, however, have one tangible effect. It prompted additional people to come forward with information. The tip line, which had been relatively quiet in the later years of the investigation, saw a spike in activity following the airing of the documentaries. Most of the tips were not actionable. They came from people who had watched the programs and believed they recognized a face or a location, or who had theories based on their own interpretation of the evidence. But a small number of the tips were substantive, providing new names, new details, and new avenues of investigation that the task force had not previously explored. These tips were investigated with the same thoroughness that had characterized the earlier phases of the case, and while none of them led directly to an arrest, they contributed to the ongoing accumulation of information that the task force hoped would eventually reach a critical mass, a point at which the pieces would finally fit together and the picture would become clear. One tip in particular deserves mention, not because it solved the case but because it illustrates the complexity and the frustration of the investigation. In 2018, an individual contacted the task force and claimed to have information about a man who had been active on East Central Avenue in the early 2000s and who had boasted, in private conversations, about killing women and burying them in the desert. The individual provided a name, a physical description, and several specific details about the man's activities that were consistent with the known facts of the case. The task force investigated the tip aggressively, locating the man, obtaining his criminal record, and conducting surveillance on his movements. The man had a history of violence against women, including several arrests for assault and one conviction for sexual battery. He had lived in Albuquerque during the period of the killings and had been known to frequent the East Central Corridor. On paper, he looked like a viable suspect, but the investigation quickly ran into familiar obstacles. The man denied any involvement in the West Mesa murders and declined to provide a DNA sample voluntarily. The task force sought a court order to compel a sample, but the legal threshold for such an order, probable cause to believe that the individual had committed the crime, had not been met. The information provided by the tipster, while suggestive, was hearsay, and the man's criminal history, while troubling, was not evidence of the specific crimes under investigation. Without DNA, without physical evidence, and without a confession, the case against this individual could not proceed. The tip was filed, the information was preserved, and the investigation moved on, leaving behind yet another unanswered question in a case that was already drowning in them. By 2020, more than a decade after the discovery of the West Mesa burial site, the case had reached a point that the families had long feared, and that the investigators had long dreaded. It was not closed, it was not forgotten, but it was, for all practical purposes, stalled. The evidence had been examined and re-examined. The suspects had been investigated and re-investigated. The tips had been followed and the leads had been pursued, and the result was the same. a vast accumulation of information that pointed in many directions but converged on none. The task force still existed, reduced now to a handful of detectives who carried the West Mesa files alongside their other caseloads. The forensic evidence was stored in climate-controlled facilities, awaiting the next advance in technology that might unlock its secrets. The family still called, still asked for updates, still hoped, and as always kept its silence. Then Ron Irwin died. He passed away in a New Mexico prison in 2020, where he had been serving time for crimes unrelated to the West Mesa murders. His death removed one of the last living suspects from the investigation and prompted a fresh round of speculation about whether Irwin had been the killer and whether his death meant that the case would never be solved. The task force released a statement noting Irwin's death and reiterating that the investigation remained open. The families reacted with a mixture of anger and resignation. If Irwin had been the killer, then he had died without ever being held accountable. If he had not been the killer, then the real perpetrator was still out there, and one more potential lead had been permanently closed. The death of Ron Irwin also prompted a reassessment of the investigation's focus. With both Montoya and Irwin dead, the two primary suspects who had dominated the case for over a decade were gone, and the task force was forced to confront the possibility that neither of them had been the killer, that the real perpetrator was someone who had never been identified, someone who had escaped the investigative net entirely. This was a sobering realization, but it was also, in a strange way, liberating. Freed from the gravitational pull of Montoya and Irwin, the investigators could cast a wider net, re-examine evidence that had been viewed through the lens of those two suspects, and consider possibilities that had previously been overshadowed. This wider net produced a renewed focus on several areas that had been underexplored in the earlier phases of the investigation. One of these areas was the transient population that had moved through Albuquerque during the period of the killings. The city, situated at the intersection of Interstate 40 and Interstate 25, was a major crossroads for long-haul truckers, itinerant workers, and people passing through the Southwest. The idea that the West Mesa killer might have been a transient, someone who did not live in Albuquerque permanently, but who passed through regularly enough to develop familiarity with the East Central Corridor and the surrounding desert, had been considered early in the investigation, but had not been pursued with the same intensity as the local suspects. With Montoya and Irwin no longer dominating the investigative landscape, the task force returned to this possibility with fresh energy. The transient theory had several points in its favor. It would explain how the killer had been able to operate for years without being identified. If he did not live in Albuquerque, he would not have been part of the local social networks that typically produce tips and information in serial crime cases. It would explain the apparent cessation of killings after 2005. The killer might have simply stopped coming to Albuquerque, or shifted his activities to another city along his route. And it would be consistent with patterns observed in other serial murder cases, most notably the long-haul trucker killings that the FBI had been tracking through its Highway Serial Killings Initiative, a program established in 2009 to identify and investigate serial murders connected to the interstate highway system. The Highway Serial Killings Initiative had produced sobering results. The FBI had identified more than 750 cases of murder and attempted murder that were believed to be connected to the trucking industry, committed by individuals who used the anonymity and mobility of long-haul trucking to prey on vulnerable victims along the nation's highways. The victims in these cases were overwhelmingly women who had been involved in sex work at truck stops, rest areas, and along the urban corridors that served as waypoints for truckers. The parallels to the West Mesa case were unmistakable. East Central Avenue, with its cheap motels and its population of women engaged in survival sex work, was exactly the kind of environment that these mobile predators targeted. And the West Mesa, located near the intersection of two major interstates, was exactly the kind of disposal site that a mobile killer might use, remote enough to avoid detection, accessible enough to reach from the highway system, and familiar enough to someone who had driven past it repeatedly over the course of months or years. The task force contacted the FBI's Highway Serial Killings Unit and shared information about the West Mesa case. The FBI, in turn, provided the task force with data from its database of highway-related murders, including cases that shared geographic and victimological characteristics with the Albuquerque killings. Several cases were flagged for further review, including a series of unsolved murders in other cities along the I-40 corridor, cities like Amarillo, Oklahoma City, and Little Rock, where women with similar profiles had been found dead under circumstances that bore some resemblance to the West Mesa case. Whether these cases were connected to the Albuquerque killings or merely shared common characteristics because they involved similar types of victims and similar types of predators was impossible to determine without more evidence. But the possibility that the West Mesa killer had left a trail of victims across multiple states added a new and deeply unsettling dimension to the investigation. The FBI collaboration also brought additional resources to bear on the case, including access to federal forensic laboratories and databases that were not available to local law enforcement. Federal analysts re-examined some of the physical evidence from the West Mesa burial site, applying techniques and technologies that had not been available when the evidence was first processed. The results of these analyses have not been fully disclosed to the public, but the task force has indicated that they provided new information that was being incorporated into the ongoing investigation. The nature of this new information, whether it pointed toward a specific suspect, a specific method of killing, or a specific connection between the victims, remains confidential. Held close by investigators who have learned the hard way that premature disclosure can compromise a case and destroy the possibility of prosecution. The secrecy surrounding the investigation was itself a source of frustration for the families and the public. In the age of true crime podcasts and armchair detective culture, there was an expectation of transparency that the task force could not and would not meet. Every piece of information that was withheld was interpreted, by some as evidence of incompetence or cover-up. Every refusal to comment was seen as confirmation that the investigation was going nowhere. The families who had been promised updates and communication sometimes felt that they were being kept in the dark, that the investigators knew more than they were sharing, and that the secrecy was designed to protect the department rather than the integrity of the case. The investigators, for their part, maintained that confidentiality was essential, that the disclosure of certain information could tip off the killer, if the killer was still alive, and that the preservation of the case for potential prosecution required discipline and discretion. This tension between transparency and confidentiality played out in a particularly painful way in 2021, when a local television station obtained and broadcast details of the investigation that the task force had considered confidential. The broadcast included information about specific evidence found at the burial site, the identities of individuals who had been questioned but not charged, and the internal deliberations of the task force regarding the prioritization of suspects. The task force was furious, believing that the broadcast had compromised the investigation and potentially alerted the killer to the direction of the inquiry. The families were divided. Some were grateful for the additional information, which they felt they had a right to know, while others were dismayed might have damaged the chances of ever securing a conviction. The episode highlighted the impossible balancing act that defined the case: the family's legitimate need for information and closure on one hand, and the investigative imperative of secrecy on the other. Despite these challenges, the investigation continued to evolve. In 2022, the task force announced that it was partnering with a private forensic laboratory that specialized in extracting DNA from highly degraded samples. The laboratory, which had achieved notable successes in other cold cases, used proprietary techniques that could recover genetic material from samples that had been considered too compromised for traditional analysis. The task force submitted several items of evidence from the West Mesa case, and the laboratory began the painstaking process of extraction and analysis. This was not the first time that the evidence had been subjected to advanced DNA analysis, and the families, chastened by previous disappointments, received the news with cautious hope rather than unbridled optimism. But there was a recognition, among both the families and the investigators, that the technology was improving at an accelerating rate, and that each new round of analysis brought the investigation closer to the threshold at which a definitive result might be possible. The private laboratory's work was expected to take several months, and during the waiting period, the task force turned its attention to another aspect of the case that had received relative little public discussion: the unborn child. Among the 11 women whose remains had been recovered from the West Mesa, one had been pregnant at the time of her death. The fetal remains had been found alongside the mother's, and the forensic analysis had determined that the pregnancy had been in its advanced stages. The child had been viable, or nearly so, at the time of death. The identity of the mother had been established, but the identity of the father, the man who had fathered the unborn child, had not. The task force had obtained a DNA profile from the fetal remains, and this profile, which contained genetic material from both the mother and the father, was potentially one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in the entire case. If the father could be identified, and if the father turned out to be the killer, then the DNA profile of the unborn child could provide the direct, definitive link between the killer and at least one of the victims. The significance of this evidence had been recognized from the beginning of the investigation, and the fetal DNA had been compared against every known suspect and person of interest. No match had been found, but as genetic genealogy databases grew and as the techniques for analyzing degraded DNA improved, the chances of identifying the father increased. The task force, working with the private laboratory and a team of genetic genealogists, began the process of building a family tree from the paternal DNA. This was a complex undertaking, requiring the identification of distant genetic relatives in the genealogy databases and the construction of a family tree that could be narrowed, branch by branch, until it pointed to a specific individual. The technique had been used successfully in other cases, most famously in the identification of the Golden State Killer, and there was cautious optimism that it might finally produce a breakthrough in the West Mesa investigation. The genealogy work was slow and meticulous, involving not just laboratory science but also traditional genealogical research, the examination of birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and other historical documents that could help connect the genetic data to real individuals. The genealogists worked in secrecy, aware that the disclosure of their work could compromise the investigation, and the families were told only that a new analytical effort was underway, without specifics. The waiting was, as always, excruciating. The families had learned to live with uncertainty, but each new initiative, each new promise of progress, reopened the wound and intensified the longing for resolution. While the genealogy work continued behind closed doors, the public-facing aspects of the case took on a new character. The 20th anniversary of the first known disappearance, that of Evelyn Salazar in 2003, was approaching, and the families and their advocates planned a series of commemorative events designed to draw attention to the case and to honor the memory of the victims. These events included a candlelight vigil at the memorial near the burial site, a community walk along East Central Avenue, and a public forum at which the families spoke about their experiences and called for renewed commitment to solving the case. The events were well attended, drawing hundreds of community members, many of whom had personal connections to the case or to the neighborhoods affected by the killings. The vigil, held at dusk on a warm autumn evening, was a deeply moving event. The names of the 11 women were read aloud one by one, and after each name, a candle was lit and placed on the ground. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the desert sand, and the silence between the names was the kind of silence that feels like a physical presence, heavy and solemn and full of unspoken grief. The public forum was a different kind of event, less contemplative, more urgent. The families spoke with a raw, unfiltered honesty that was both powerful and painful. They talked about what it was like to live with an unsolved murder. They talked about the birthdays they celebrated without their daughters and sisters, the holidays that felt hollow, the moments of joy that were always shadowed by the awareness of who was missing. They talked about the toll that the case had taken on their health, their relationships, their ability to function in the world. And they talked about their determination to keep fighting, to keep demanding answers, to refuse to let the passage of time erase the urgency of their cause. Several of the speakers broke down in tears during their remarks, and the audience wept with them. It was a collective expression of grief and rage and love that transcended the specifics of the case and touched something universal: the fundamental human need to know what happened to the people we have lost, and to hold accountable those who took them from us. The commemorative events also served a strategic purpose. By generating media coverage and public attention, they put pressure on the police department to demonstrate progress and commit resources to the investigation. The department, aware of the optics, issued a statement reaffirming its commitment to solving the case and announcing that significant investigative work was underway, though it declined to provide specifics. The statement was met with the familiar mix of hope and skepticism that had characterized the family's response to every official communication since the beginning of the case. They had heard these words before. They wanted to believe them. But belief, after so many years of disappointment, did not come easily. The period between 2022 and 24 was one of the most active in the investigation since the initial years following the discovery. The private laboratory's DNA work, the genetic genealogy effort, the FBI collaboration, and the renewed public attention combined to create a sense of momentum that had been absent for years. The task force, reinvigorated by the new resources and the new avenues of inquiry, pursued leads with an energy that surprised even the families. There were moments during this period when it seemed possible, genuinely, tantalizingly possible, that the case might finally be solved. Tips came in from unexpected sources. Forensic analyses produced results that, while not conclusive, were more promising than anything that had come before. And the genetic genealogy work, though still incomplete, was progressing steadily, narrowing the family tree and moving closer to a potential identification. But as of the most recent public updates, the case remains unsolved. No arrest has been made. No individual has been formally charged with the murder of the 11 women found on the West Mesa. The investigation is ongoing, and the task force has indicated that it is pursuing active leads, but the specifics of those leads have not been disclosed. The families continue to wait, continue to hope, continue to grieve. The memorial near the burial site still stands, weathered by the desert wind, but still bearing the names of the 11 women who were found in the sand. And the question that has haunted this case from the very beginning, who did this, remains unanswered. The failure to solve the West Mesa case is not, in the final analysis, a failure of effort. The investigators who have worked this case over the past 15 years have given it everything they have. They have spent thousands of hours, followed hundreds of leads, and applied every available technology to the evidence. The failure, if it can be called that, is a failure of circumstance, of evidence degraded by time, of witnesses lost to memory and mortality, of a crime committed in an environment where the normal investigative tools were rendered ineffective by the nature of the victims' lives and the conditions of their deaths. It is also a failure of timing. The murders occurred during a period when the technology that might have solved them did not yet exist, and the evidence that might have been preserved was lost to the years that elapsed before the bodies were found. But the failure is also, inescapably, a failure of the systems that should have prevented these murders or detected them sooner. The West Mesa case is a monument to the consequences of neglect, of what happens when a society decides, however implicitly, that certain lives are not worth protecting. The 11 women who were buried in the desert were not faceless abstractions. They were people. They had names and families and histories and dreams. They had mothers who loved them and children who needed them and friends who missed them. They deserved better than the lives they were given. And they deserved better than the deaths they suffered. And they deserved better than the slow, grinding, incomplete justice that has been the only response to their murders. The case has changed Albuquerque in ways that are both visible and invisible. The reforms that were implemented in the wake of the discovery, the improved protocols for missing person cases, the dedicated unit for monitoring violence against vulnerable populations, the expanded outreach and support services, are tangible legacies of the 11 women's deaths. These reforms have saved lives. They have led to the earlier identification of potential predators, the faster investigation of disappearances, and the better protection of the women who continue to work on the streets of East Central Avenue. They are not enough. They will never be enough to compensate for what was lost, but they are something. They are evidence that the deaths were not entirely in vain, that the horror of the West Mesa produced, alongside the grief and the rage, a determination to do better. The case has also changed the national conversation about serial crime and the vulnerability of marginalized populations. The West Mesa murders, along with cases like the Grim Sleeper and the Long Island serial killer, have forced a reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that serial predators thrive in environments of inequality and neglect. They target the vulnerable because the vulnerable are easier to target, and because their disappearances are less likely to be noticed and investigated. The solution to this problem is not simply better detective work or better forensic technology, though both of those things are important. The solution is a fundamental change in the way society values and protects its most vulnerable members, a commitment to the principle that every life has equal worth, that every disappearance deserves an equal response, and that the circumstances of a victim's life should never determine the intensity of the investigation into their death. This is the lesson of the West Mesa. It is a lesson that has been learned at an unconscionable cost, written in the bones of 11 women who were buried in the desert and forgotten by everyone except the people who loved them. It is a lesson that Albuquerque is still learning, that the country is still learning, that we are all still learning. And it is a lesson that will not be complete until the question that started it all, who did this, is finally answered. The names remain Monica Candelario Elks, Michelle Valdez, Jamie Barella, Doreen Marquez, Evelyn Salazar, Veronica Romero, Julie Nito, Sylvia Hutton, Virginia Cloven, Jessica Roybal, and one child who never had a name at all. They were daughters. They were mothers. They were sisters and friends and human beings who walked through the world with beating hearts and open eyes and the same fragile, stubborn hope that carries all of us from one day to the next. They were not defined by their addictions. They were not defined by the streets they walked, or the choices they made under the crushing weight of circumstances that most of us will never have to face. They were defined by the people who loved them, by the memories that survived them, by the empty chairs at kitchen tables, and the photographs that sit on mantels in houses across Albuquerque. Photographs of smiling faces that will never grow older. The desert has been quiet for a long time now. The memorial stands at the edge of the West Mesa bearing their names. Weathered by wind and sun but still legible, still visible to anyone who makes the drive out to that lonely stretch of land. Flowers appear there on anniversaries and birthdays, placed by hands that tremble with a grief that has not faded and will not fade, not until the last person who remembers these women draws their final breath. The candles flicker and go out, and new ones are lit, and the cycle continues year after year, a ritual of remembrance that is both an act of love and an act of defiance, defiance against forgetting, against indifference, against a world that looked the other way while 11 women were taken from it. The investigation remains open. The evidence sits in storage, waiting for the advance in technology or the turn of fortune that will finally unlock its secrets. The detectives who have given years of their lives to this case have not stopped believing that an answer is possible. The families have not stopped demanding one. And somewhere, in a database or a laboratory, or a file that has not yet been opened, the piece of the puzzle that will bring everything into focus may already exist, waiting to be recognized for what it is. Until that day comes, the story of the West Mesa 11 is a story without an ending. It is a story about loss and failure and the terrible patience of the dead. But it is also a story about love. The love of the families who refused to stop searching, the love of the investigators who refused to stop working, the love of a community that learned, too late but not too late to matter, that every life is worth fighting for. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.